Are you constantly dying while holding angles in Valorant? You don't know where and how to properly position yourself. Enemies are killing you no matter how much you train your aim and movement. Well, your Radiant coach is here to explain how to become more unpredictable and kill enemies only with godlike positioning. But before we start with your improvement at Valorant, it's time to improve your browsing and gaming on the internet! Opera GX is the world's first gaming browser that's actually amazing, and it's not a clickbait title. For years, I've been using browsers that are stealing my computer's RAM and resources in the same way Reyna Smurfs steal your elo in Valorant. And using Opera GX is like you have Charlatan in your team to showcase that Reyna who's the real boss. With Opera browser and GX control, you can actually customize how much RAM, CPU and bandwidth are being used while you're listening to some hardcore music and simultaneously dominating your enemies in ranked SoloQ without setting your PC on fire. And unlike other browsers that flashbang you with white backgrounds every time you open them up, you can customize the color theme and force dark mode on every page. It even has some extra integrations and perks to upgrade your browsing experience, like GX Player for your favorite music service, Twitch to see when your favorite streamers are live like Charlatan, or Discord for your friends that are begging you to boost them from low elo. Also, there is a GX corner that allows you to stay up to date with free games, the best deals and breaking gaming news, all in one easily accessible place, so that you're never missing some important Valorant patches and updates. And I know that majority of you guys don't like changes, but you always need to learn and adapt yourself in order to improve, same as you do in Valorant. So with Opera, it's actually easy to make this change with quick import to bring all of your settings like bookmarks and passwords over from other browsers. Download Opera GX via the link down below and improve your browsing and gaming experience forever. Let's start this guide by saying that positioning is equally important as your aim and movement. This is like a holy trinity of your fundamentals that you need to improve in order to reach higher ranks. So today we're going to cover all of the most important positioning tips and tricks that are going to help you with being unpredictable, winning more post plants and gaining advantage over your enemies. Oh, and by the way, what's up, tricksters? My name is Charlatan. I'm the all-time Radiant player from closed beta and professional Valorant coach that successfully improved thousands of players in the last 2 years. And I'm here to improve you as well. Some of the players that purchased my coaching programs managed to go from bronze to Radiant. So there's a hope for every single one of you that watch Charlatan's content. Now you need to understand two very important Valorant positioning and movement rules that are going to help you when you're holding angles. Number 1, angle holding rule. Player that is moving is always in some kind of an advantage over the player that is standing still, and we call this phenomenon in FPS games the peeker's advantage. Even though enemy appeared on one specific location, his real position can be a few steps forward or backwards because of Valorant server's inconsistency. If you're holding some kind of a common position or enemies revealed you and they can easily pre-fire with good crosshair placement, we always want to hold that angle with strafing type of movement to make our body change its location consistently, and when enemies peek you, you want to stop and shoot with 100% accuracy. The best thing to do in situations where enemies can clear you with peeker's advantage and proper crosshair placement is to counter their movement with yours and eliminate that advantage when you hear or anticipate the enemies. In that situation, mechanical skill and reaction time will determine a winner of that gunfight. If you're holding some kind of an off angle, narrow angle, position where you can surprise enemies, or you're playing operator, you don't need to move at all, because in that situation we're using surprise mechanic to throw off enemies' crosshair placement, or we are playing a very powerful one-tap elo stick. Number 2, angle holding rule. Player that is standing further away from the wall has angle perception advantage over the player that is closer to that specific wall. An example of this would be if you peek enemies on B site while shifting from the mid window right here. They can already see your body and shoulder right at this moment of your peek, and you have absolutely zero visuals over the enemies on B site. Generally speaking, when you're holding angles, you want to move yourself as far away as possible from that specific angle so you can see enemy's body before they see you. And if you're forced to play a bit closer to the angles, then it's always beneficial to strafe a bit or to engage enemies aggressively before they peek you. I highly recommend you, after watching this video, to check out my previous in-depth movement guide, because there I've completely covered all of these and many more advantages and how to counter them with proper movement, such as high ping. But today I'm going to teach you how to abuse some of these advantages with proper positioning. Now, there are only two types of angles that you're consistently holding in Valorant, and those are standard and off angles. Standard angles are the most common positions which players usually hold. An example of a standard angle would be holding a long area of Haven from this position. Pretty much any main area of the map consists of these common angles which are very easy to be cleared with proper crosshair placement and utility. You'll see that high elo players pre-fire a lot of these common positions, because they are very predictable and it's easy to practice clearing them. Usually angle perception and peeker's advantage are working against you on this type of positions, which is why the enemies on attacker's side have easier time killing you. So whenever you're holding these common angles, you always want to hold them with some kind of a movement. What you need to do is holding common angles while constantly strafing or peeking and unpeeking that angle in a random intervals of time. This movement will completely counter the enemy's peeker's advantage, but also it will make you a harder target to pre-fire. And if you're peeking and unpeeking angle at random intervals of time, there is a chance that you'll catch enemies with a peek at the moment when they've already cleared you and they started clearing the next position, which gives you an advantage over them. The best timing to peek and unpeek these common positions is when you think that enemies are pushing you forward, because then they're easier targets to kill. So you want to primarily hold the positions where enemies are forced to push with W key. And another important positioning rule for these common angles is to hold them as further away as possible from the walls and boxes to eliminate angle perception advantage of enemies. These standard angles are very important to be held properly, because your primary job on these positions is not to kill the enemies, but to gather information for your team or to create some kind of a setup with your teammates to surprise the enemies. Which leads us to the second type of angles in Valorant, and those are off angles. These angles are the positions which you typically don't expect someone to hold, and we use them to create some kind of a surprise mechanic or setup with our teammates that is going to grant us one easy kill, and then we reposition ourselves. Essentially, we're trying to catch one enemy off guard and escape with a kill. These are the positions for which players usually don't have a good crosshair placement. So a few off-angle examples in a main area of Haven would be if you position yourself on top of this box with some kind of a movement ability, or you're standing on top of the ultimate orb in the middle of nowhere. Usually you wouldn't expect players to play this type of a position, because if they did, they'd get instantly traded, but that is the whole surprise mechanic behind off angles. The main purpose of this positioning is to completely throw off enemies' crosshair placement, while creating numbers advantage for your team, and in return, you're sacrificing a bit of your safety, which is completely opposite from standard angles. All the off angles where you have some kind of a cover behind which you can drop or hide, we call protected off angles. One subcategory of off angles are so-called unprotected or one and done angles. Essentially, one and done off angles are common angles which usually get cleared, but they have a high risk and high reward. These positions typically grant you only one kill, because you will usually get traded if there is a second enemy. Examples of one and done angles would be playing behind this box in A main of Haven, or on the right side of C long, left side of A long, behind the boxing garage, and there's hundreds of these positions in Valorant.
So Charlotte, if I'm just gonna get traded or die from abilities, why would I even consider playing this type of an angle?
The main advantage of these one and done positions is a probability of not being properly cleared by the first enemy or recon abilities, and you can get away with much more than just one kill. A lot of times when players are pushing or executing some area of the map, they are pre-assuming that first player is going to clear every single angle that he's approaching. But if recon abilities or the first enemy doesn't clear you properly on this type of a position, there's a huge chance that the rest of the enemy team also won't clear you, and they will completely ignore that spot. When this situation happens, it's extremely important to play on trigger discipline and don't kill the first enemy as soon as you see him. You need to play these situations properly and choose the right moment to maybe even kill the whole enemy team from behind. Now, when should you consider playing an off angle? Preferably whenever you can, and you should abuse them as much as possible, especially if you're in the ranks that are below Immortal, where players usually have terrible crosshair placement. And as there is less enemies on the map, the more off angles you should play, because the chances are lower that you're gonna get traded. But these rules also depend on the agent that you're playing. Off angles are something that you need to abuse as much as possible when you're playing agents that can get one kill quickly and then get out. This includes Jet, Reyna, and Chamber. With these agents, essentially every position is an off angle for them. Also, agents with movement or escape type of abilities such as Omen, Raze, Yoru, and Neon can abuse enormous amount of elevated positions and off angles. But even if you're playing some other controller or sentinel agent, you can actually create off angles with your abilities and redesign the map in your favor. For an example, with Viper Wall, you can create small spots and angles in which you can hide and surprise the enemies as they've already pushed you into the bomb site. With Sage Wall, you have countless of spots where you can boost yourself and create off angles which enemies usually don't expect. And there's countless of these little tricks that you can do with almost any agent. Now, no matter which angle you're holding, it's extremely important that you're always anticipating enemies' peek with proper crosshair placement, because good crosshair placement is more important than raw aim. If you always have perfect crosshair placement, you minimize the amount of flicks, tracking, and micro adjustments that you need to perform, which guarantees you on easier gunfights. Anticipating enemies basically means that we're placing our crosshair where we think that enemy body is going to end up once they perform some kind of a peek, and we're shooting enemies as they're walking into our crosshair. You need to take in consideration audio of footsteps and how enemies usually peeked you in previous rounds or matches on that specific angle. So let's say, for an example, you're holding B short of bind from this window position. If I don't hear any footsteps of enemies pushing, I'm going to place my crosshair a bit closer to this specific wall and anticipate that enemies will perform some kind of a shoulder or slow peek. But if I hear enemies running like a stampedo, I'll place my crosshair a bit wider and anticipate that they will perform some kind of a wide peek. If you want to learn more about this topic, I highly recommend you to watch my video where I've explained some secret crosshair placement tricks to get more kills. And when this video reaches 2000 likes, I'm going to make an in-depth crosshair placement guide and showcase you how to properly practice this mechanic to improve your aim tremendously. So if you don't want to miss any important videos for your improvement in the future, I highly recommend you to hit the subscribe button, turn your notifications on, and tell me down in the comments which guide would you like to see next, baby. Every single round in a game of Valorant, you should start with some kind of a plan, especially when it comes to your positioning. You need to have some kind of a path that you want to follow, a clear vision of how you want to surprise or counter the enemies, and adapt yourself as the round is progressing. When it comes to reading the enemies, you need to remember that players in Valorant are 90% of times following some kind of a pattern when it comes to utility usage, positioning, or pushing bomb sites. And this pattern becomes very easy to read as you're developing your game knowledge and game sense, which is one of my primary focuses when I'm improving players in my coaching sessions. Always ask yourself which agents enemies have, which utility they have, what players usually do on a specific map with specific agents, take in consideration enemies' economy, and try to learn as much as possible from your previous rounds or matches. That's why self-observation and VOD reviewing is extremely important for your improvement. There's a lot of different scenarios that you're going to play in Valorant, but the number of them is not endless, and you can learn from these scenarios to adapt yourself better in the future games. Just ask yourself these questions when you consider playing a certain angle. How I want to hold it in terms of my movement and positioning. Where should I place my crosshair? From which angles can enemies kill me? From which angles will enemies peek me first? Am I too overexposed? What type of utility enemies have to counter me? Which path do I want to follow as I'm getting pushed back by the enemies? For an example, I'm playing Bind on B site. Enemies have Brimstone and Fade ultimate. From this information, we know that I cannot play passively on B's site, because their ultimates will completely push me back and they have a free site control. Our team needs to be more aggressive, and we need to fight enemies in the garden or window position before they even start executing bomb site. If they push us from garden, we'll play on the next safe position, which is maybe top of this pillar if I'm playing Jet. But if all of my teammates are pushed from the bomb site into CT and enemies are stomping us with their utility, I'll play a retake with them and fall back all the way into the elbow. Remember that in Valorant, majority of times it's better to bait out enemies' utility, stay alive, and play retake with your team, instead of dying solo trying to be some kind of a hero. Your team is in the numbers disadvantage, and also they don't have your potentially useful utility for the retake. Also, sometimes it's completely fine to sell the whole bomb site without even contesting the enemies in main areas of the map, and you always need to adapt to what your enemies and teammates are doing. Now, this also leads us into the next topic of when you should be aggressive or passive, and it usually depends on which agent you're playing, in which rank, on which map, what your team is doing, and what happened in previous rounds. This is really hard to explain in one video, but generally speaking, what most of you need to improve in your gameplay is to stop wasting time and become useful for your team. If your teammates are already pushing an angle that you are holding, you either want to push with them or immediately rotate on some other position. If your teammates are consistently dying on mid of ascent because they're taking some stupid gunfights, you need to fight with them and figure out how you can support them with your presence and utility. Or for an example, enemy Killjoy has ultimate on attacker side of ascent. That means that we need to take full control of both A and B main areas of the map. If your team already has a very good information that all of the enemies are pushing the opposite part of the map from what you are playing, you either want to take more map control from the enemies, or you want to rotate and play together with your team. Sometimes it's good to be more aggressive and give your teammates an early information if enemies are rotating to bomb site that you are playing. But this always holds a certain amount of risk that you're gonna die without taking any kills, or just being traded. So if you're playing some kind of a controller or sentinel, maybe it's not the best idea to go for a solo and risky aggressive plays with, let's say, Cypher. But on the other hand, if you're playing Omen on Bind and enemies planted spike on A site, you can maybe smoke enemy's chamber trademark where it's commonly being positioned and potentially surprise enemies with a flank. And don't even get me started when it comes to lurking on attacker's side. Overall, this is something that you learn from trial and error, as you're observing not only what enemies are doing, but also what your teammates are doing and how good or bad they are. I usually teach players to play on a refrag potential, together with their team, always having someone to trade them or to perform some kind of a baiting strategy. Playing with your team is always better than trying to go for some solo plays 24/7, but also don't be afraid to go for solo plays when you think that's gonna benefit your team, because the best way for you to learn is through failure. You can't be a passive potato forever. Now let's talk about some very important angle holding rules and strategies that are going to guarantee you more kills and winning more rounds. Rule number 1. Valorant is a team play game where proper SoloQ strategies and communication are going to give you higher chances to win. Always try communicating to your teammates what you see, what you're holding, or what you want to do.
But Charlatan, I'm playing in gold and my teammates are poo-poo caca and they don't communicate at all.
So what? You should be the positive change for your team. Use the microphone, give them the information, or tell them to do something that's gonna give you higher chances of winning. And at the end of the day, if they don't want to listen to your calls, just adapt to what your teammates are doing. For an example, if your teammates on defender's side are pushing mid area of Haven and you're playing Omen, give them smoke in the window and flash enemies from garage. Which brings us to the rule number 2. Valorant is a game of numbers and trading. When we're in the numbers advantage or equal, we're always trying to fight together with one or more of our teammates, so we can have easier time killing the enemies and securing rounds. Here, the basic concepts of proper positioning can help us a lot, and those are playing crossfires, peeking off contact or utility, and double peek setups. So for an example, if you're playing some kind of a post plant in a 2 versus 1 situation, the best thing to do is to force the remaining enemy to fight both of you in the same time, and this can be performed in the following ways. First thing that you can do is playing a crossfire setup, where the basic concept is to position ourselves in the same line of sight on the opposite location from our teammate and make the sandwich of our enemies. When enemy peeks you in this type of a setup, he needs to prioritize one gunfight at this moment of time, and there's almost no chance at all that he's gonna kill both of you. Second thing that you can do is peeking the remaining enemy off contact or with utility, and in this concept, one player is hiding behind a cover and waiting for the second player to pick a gunfight, so that we can surprise that enemy or disallow him to take additional space. Or you can simply tell your teammate that you want to peek the remaining enemy together after some kind of an ability has been deployed, because this will guarantee you an even easier kill. And the third thing that you need to implement in your gameplay is a double peek setup, where both of you want to peek the enemies in the same time from 2 completely different locations. When you're performing these type of setups, it's very important to keep in mind that you want to see enemies in the same time as your teammate, and disallow enemies to kill you one by one in solo gunfights. Rule number 3. Develop good and simple SoloQ strategies that you can easily replicate in any elo and with any teammates. One of my favorite strategies are double tower, baiting, anti-flash, and anti-utility setups. Double tower angle holding strategy is when you and your teammate are on 2 completely different vertical positions in the same horizontal line. With this type of a setup, it's almost impossible that enemies are gonna be ready to fight both of you at the same moment of time, and this setup can be easily performed on multiple different locations in Valorant, but it works the best with movement type of agents that can easily reach some extreme off angles, like for an example, creating a double tower setup on top of this wall on ascent to hold B main area of the map. Baiting setups can be created almost anywhere, especially in main areas of any map in Valorant to surprise the enemies. The main concept here is that one agent is playing in some kind of an off angle from which he is trying to surprise the enemies, and second agent is baiting his position from some kind of a common angle. The main job of second agent is to put pressure onto the enemies and survive while slowly digressing to his second position. The main job of first agent is to surprise enemies while trying to get 2 or more kills, and if possible, escaping and surviving this gunfight. That's why it's always the best if first agent is some kind of a character that can easily escape this type of positions. And if you think that enemies will flash you while you're pushing or playing some kind of an angle, always play anti-flash setups where one teammate is hiding behind a cover or wall to dodge that flash and help the rest of his team survive, or simply trading that enemy which peeks you. And if you want to play some kind of an unprotected off angle or position where enemies can easily reveal you with some kind of a utility, tell your teammates to destroy those abilities for you and play anti-utility setups. Rule number 4. Never play in corners when you're holding an angle. One of the biggest low elo mistakes is sitting in corners, because these positions are always cleared by enemies, and in the same time you have nowhere to escape. You cannot get traded, and angle perception advantage is working against you, which means that enemies will always see you first. What you want to do in these corners, but also in general when you're holding some close angles, is position yourself a bit away from a corner or wall, especially if you want to play close angles with short-range weapons such as Judge. Rule number 5. Stop being overexposed. Always have some kind of a cover or escape route and simplify the angles that you're holding. For an example, if you're playing an overexposed elevated positions, you should always play these positions on the absolute edge of them. So if you get flashed, stunned, or gunfight isn't going in your favor, favor, you can quickly drop behind these spots with your knife out and safely reposition yourself for the next fight. If you're exposed from 2 or more opposite angles when you're playing some position, chances are that position is absolutely terrible for you, and you should try to eliminate some of these angles from which you can die with better positioning. And if you need to get information for your team, whether the enemies are pushing into bomb site or not, you can always use jump spotting mechanic to reveal enemies and then fight them one by one, instead of dying in some kind of a crossfire. Many of these rules of simplifying angles I've explained in this angle holding video, where I'll share some very important tips and tricks for better positioning, so I highly recommend you to check that one as well. Rule number 6. Reposition whenever you think you're in some kind of a danger. In Valorant, most of the times it's better for you and your team to survive rather than going for some kind of a hero plays 24/7. I usually recommend players, after they peek or hold some angle, to reposition themselves to the next angle from which they can surprise enemies. Most of the times you're just going to die if you re-peek the angles on which enemies have already revealed you. And also you need to understand the Valorant maps in order to have the best possible positioning and repositioning. For an example, if you're playing A site of Ascent and your teammate dies on short, you should never stay alone on A site, risking death from 3 different angles while having 0 information for your team. There are 3 things that you need to do in this type of a scenario. You can take A main control and try to pressure or flank enemies from behind. You can reposition to this location where you can hold both A main and short area of the map for your team and gather information. Or because garden area of Ascent is more important than A site, you can close the doors, sell the A site control, and hold short area of the map from this off angle where enemies probably won't expect you after you close the doors. All of these positioning rules and strategies for every individual map I'm also covering in my coaching programs on Discord as an extra bonus. Rule number 7. Hold angles as tight and narrow as your reaction time allows you. In Valorant, the whole point of holding angles is to get information about enemies, potentially get a kill, and survive that gunfight. If you're just consistently holding angles wide, like this, you always have higher chances of being traded or dying from 2 or more enemies that are peeking you in the same time. Whenever I'm holding any angle in Valorant, I'm trying to narrow down that angle as much as my reaction time allows me in order to hit enemy's head with a first bullet or burst fire. But also, this way of holding angles allows me to hide behind a cover much faster, and I'm not risking my life in some stupid 50-50 gunfights. This rule becomes extremely important, especially if you're playing Operator or literally any one-tap weapon. Rule number 8. Expand your vision of angles when gun model is blocking them. If you're holding some angle where your gun model is blocking the vision of other positions from which enemies can kill you, you should spam inspect button or use ADS to expand your vision, so that you can see enemies on every position from which they can kill you at that moment of time. That is why some skins are literally paid to win when it comes to this mechanic. Now, proper positioning is not only important on defenders, but also attackers' side. All of the rules of movement and positioning that I mentioned in this video can help you tremendously when you're holding angles on both sides, or when you're playing post plants and retakes. But in those 2 situations, majority of times your agent and what your teammates are doing is a deciding factor when it comes to your positioning. If your agent is able to delay or stop the defuse, maybe it's not the smartest idea to be aggressive and hunt the kills, but instead use your utility to actually close the round. If your agent is able to reach different vertical positions and play off angles, most of the times that's what you should be doing in a post plant. If your agent has some kind of a flash, stun or near sight, you should be playing positions that allow you to peek enemies with these abilities. If your agent has smokes, you should definitely create some kind of a one-ways or weird setups that will disallow enemies to push through choke points or to safely defuse the spike. The main goal in post plant is to delay enemies' retake as much as possible in order for spike to explode, and it's not to kill or fight the enemies. And at the end of the day, you always need to adapt yourself to what your teammates are doing, but also what type of utility enemies have. That is why also the spike positioning is extremely important, and you always want to plant it in the open so that it's exposed to the highest numbers of angles for your team, or position it in a way where you can use some kind of a utility to completely disallow enemies defusing it. If you implement all of these positioning and movement fundamentals into your own gameplay, you will instantly become more unpredictable for the enemies. When I'm positioning myself in Valorant on both attackers and defenders side, I'm always positioning in a way where I'm trying to predict what enemies are going to do next, regardless of my team's composition, because 99% of time you're going to play with imbeciles and Paralympic players in SoloQ. It's extremely important for you to always pre-plan your rounds with solid strategies before they even start, and slowly adapt as the round is progressing. These are the questions that you need to ask yourself in preparation time. How can I make numbers advantage with my team or stop the enemy's execute? Which type of utility or team setup should I use to make that happen? Which common or off angles I want to abuse in order to surprise enemies? Where should I fall back if enemies push me from my initial angles? And from this point on, everything is about your adaptiveness as a player, which is directly impacted by your game decisions, game sense, and knowledge. But also, I've mentioned before in this video that it's extremely important for you to be unpredictable in your gunfights as well, where generally speaking, you want to reposition yourself after every single fight that you take, and try to surprise enemies from multiple different angles. And when it comes to your overall presence on the map, that is one more way in which you can be unpredictable to win or clutch more rounds. One of my best skills as a Radiant player is amount of rounds that I close or clutch for my team, and I'm able to achieve that not with my potato aim, but with proper plans for my utility and positioning. Let's say for an example, I'm in a 1 versus 1 situation with Omen, and I don't know where's the remaining enemy. I will plant the spike in an open area of the map where I can see it from multiple different angles, but also where I can use my one-ways to disallow enemies' defusal. Then I'll choose to play the least exposed area of the map where enemy either won't expect me or where I don't need to worry about him backstabbing me. And all of this gives me a huge upper hand to clutch this round. Having a solid plan, keeping your location a secret, visualizing the outcome of your rounds, playing on numbers, and utilizing different strategies with your team will grant you a higher win rate in ranked matches of Valorant. And this covers absolutely everything when it comes to proper positioning in Valorant. If you don't want to miss any important videos in the future, make sure to hit that subscribe button, turn your notifications on, leave a like and comment. Share this video with your boosted or hard-stuck friends. Check out my twitch.tv/charlatan channel for some live tips and SoloQ shenanigans. And down in the description below, you can find all of my other social media. I'm yours, one and only, Warden of the Tricksters community. Thank you for watching and cut, baby!